Welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to see some fun new material. We're going to combine our user model, the authentication that we've covered, with campgrounds to make sure that a user can't delete a campground that he or she didn't create, or a user can't edit a campground that he or she didn't create. And this is something called authorization. So authentication and authorization, they're different. Authentication refers to finding out if someone is who they say they are, while authorization is once you know who someone is, you figure out what they're allowed to do. So think of it as permissions. What is someone authorized to do? What's their security clearance in our application? So if you don't own a campground, if you don't have the same ID as the campground's author, then you won't be able to update or delete it. So let's start simple and let's work with edit so that you can't view the edit form unless you own the campground. So let's go to our campground routes right here. And what we want to do is if you try and go to the edit campground route or update and eventually delete as well, all three of them, we need to have the same logic where we just check, does the current user's ID match the ID of the author for that campground? So remember, this is what our data structure looks like, where, let me pull up the campground model. We have author for each campground, and there's an ID that's going to be an ID for a user. It references a particular user's object ID. And then we have a user, of course, that has an object ID. It's not specified here, but every user has an ID. And we're going to compare the currently logged in user's ID to the campground.author.id. So we can do that pretty easily. If we go up into our edit, we'll start there. And the first thing we want to do is check, is someone or is user logged in at all? And then if not, we'll redirect somewhere. If a user is logged in, does user own the campground? And if so, we'll let the user run this code, find by ID and delete everything. Otherwise, we'll also redirect. So let's fill this in. To start, to see if someone's logged in, we can just write if request.is authenticated. We could also use the middleware that we already defined here, is logged in. I'll show you in a moment why we're not going to do that. The short answer is that we're defining our own middleware in just a little bit. So we're going to combine that functionality inside of this middleware. So if request is authenticated, if that is the case, then we're good to go. If that's not the case, let's do a console.log to start. You need to be logged in to do that. And then we'll do a response. And let's just do a send to start. Response.send, and we'll send this actually. So if we see that, we'll know that we're not logged in, and that the first thing will be working. So let's copy this code inside the if statement and indent this properly. Okay, so we have to be logged in, which is nothing new. We've already written code to do this. So you might be thinking we're going about this in a weird way, which we kind of are, but you'll see in just a moment why. Let's test it out though. Save, start the server up. And when I start up, I'm not logged in. No one's logged in. So if I try and go to /edit, it tells me you need to be logged in to do that. So our first part is working just fine. Then once we're logged in, we're going to have another if statement in here, which is where we'll check, does the user own the campground? And the way that we'll do that is pretty simple. First thing we need to do is find the campground, which we've already done right here. And then once we find it, we need to check if the ID of the author on that campground matches current user, which is request.user, then we're good to go. So inside of here is where we actually do the does the user own the campground. We'll keep the first bit to check if there's an error. If there's no error, then we'll check does the user own the campground, because that means found campground exists. And then we'll have an if statement. It's going to be if campground.author.id And you might think that we could do this, equals request.user._id. So let me just show you what I mean. Let's do a console.log campground.author.id, and then below it, we'll do console.log request.user._id. So I'll comment out the if statement. So we'll see those two lines. I will have to be logged in, of course. If I just try and refresh right now without being logged in, we have an error. But if I do log in now as Potato Head, log in, and then I go back to Granite Mine /edit, we have a problem. Looks like, let's see. Well, that was silly. I'm trying to console.log campground.author. Campground doesn't exist. It's found campground. So we'll try that again. Restart the server. First time we refresh, it's going to tell us we need to be logged in still. So again, we log in, Potato Head, password. Okay. Now if I try and edit, take a look at what we see here. First thing that we print looks like this. So that is found campground.author.id, and then we have request.user.id, and they look like they're identical. And when they're printed out, they are identical, but behind the scenes they're actually not the same. So request.user.id or _id is a string. Found campground.author.id is an object. It's a mongoose object. And this is just a tricky one. I forget about it from time to time. It's really frustrating because they look the same when you're trying to debug. But the truth is, the first one is not actually a string. It's a mongoose object that when we print it out, we see a string. But that's just the 2-string version. Behind the scenes, it's not a string. And this is a string. So when we compare them, it won't work. So rather than comparing them with triple equals or double equals, what we can do instead is use a method that Mongoose gives us for this purpose. So what we do is write an if statement, but rather than checking campground.author.id triple equals request.user.id, we use dot equals. There we go. And now our if statement should work, except for the fact that this needs to be found campground. Again, what's coming back from the database that we're finding using that ID. So we find that with the ID based off of the route. Then we check if the author.id on that particular found campground equals the currently logged in user's ID. If that's the case, we'll do one thing. Otherwise, we'll do something else. So if that's the case, we'll do this here. Render campground page or the edit campground page with found campground. Otherwise, we'll do a res.send. You do not have permission to do that. Of course, we'll change this eventually where it won't just be a res.send, but we'll have an actual message that displays. So let's try it out. Go to our application. Go to a show page. First thing, if I try and edit it right now, I need to be logged in. Now if I log in or I sign up as someone other than Potato Head, so we'll do Tomato Head, and I try and edit that, you'll see, hopefully, there we go, I get you do not have permission to do that. Now if we go back and log out and sign back in as Potato Head and try it all again, I try and edit, I do have permission and I end up here. So it's working, which is great. Now what we'll do is actually refactor this into a separate function. Most of this logic, we'll call it something like check user campground or ensure campground user, something where we're basically checking, does the currently logged in user match this particular campground? And the reason we'll move that into a middleware is that we'll use it on edit. We also want to use it on update. We don't want someone to be able to send a request if they're not logged in. So even though, again, just using the browser, the only way to actually visually get to the update and to send data is using this form. You could use Postman. You could send a put request from Postman and not be authenticated. So we want the same logic here. And we want to do the same thing for delete. So we don't want you to be able to delete something, a campground, if you're not logged in and if you don't own it. So what we'll do is write a middleware. We'll copy this code for now. I'll leave it there, but we're going to go down for now just with our other middleware. We'll define one called check campground ownership, just like that. And then we'll paste this code and we'll have a little work to do here. But the end goal is that on our edit, we should be able to add our middleware here, check campground ownership. We should be able to do it on update and also on delete. But we'll start with edit. And what we want to do is check first. We need to add in request response in next. Remember, that's how middleware is set up, request response in next. So if the user is currently logged in, we'll keep moving. If they're not logged in, rather than doing a res.send, for now, we're going to do a res.redirect, and we haven't seen this yet. We can do res.redirect back, and that will take the user back to where they came from, the previous page that they were on. And very soon, I'm going to show you how we can send a message as well. The message we would want to send is something like, you're not logged in, or you must be logged in to do that. But we're leaving it like that for now. Then, if they are logged in, we're going to find the campground. If there's an error, we'll just redirect back as well. Again, this error would happen if the campground couldn't be found for some reason, or if the database is not connected, or some weird thing typically that we wouldn't actually see. Else, if the campground matches the request user ID, so if the user who's logged in owns this, then rather than rendering campground's edit, because we don't always want this middleware to render edit, what we want it to do is move on to the rest of the code in delete, or move on to the code in update, or in edit. So that's where we do next. Otherwise, if they don't own it, we'll do a res.redirect back. Great. So let's try this out. Save it, and we'll go and update our edit route right here. We can trim this down a lot. So we don't need to do any of this really, except for we do want to find the campground, and all that we'll do is if we find a campground, we don't need to check if it matches anymore because we're doing that in the middleware. So all we want to do is find a campground, can get rid of all of this, almost all of this, format this correctly. So we'll outdent a little bit. There we go. So because we added check campground ownership right here, all that we're doing now is if we get to this point, it means that we already checked campground ownership and that we made it through. Otherwise, if there's a problem, we would have redirected. Let's see what the error I'm getting is. We have a small syntax error here, which is I somehow deleted my function declaration here. And you can see it's complaining that we're not handling the error, which we could handle. But the thing is, if we get to this point, there shouldn't be an error with finding by ID because we did it down here. And if it worked here, then we should be good to go. Anyway, so let's try it out though, see if we have any issues. Basically, we just moved our code out into a separate function. And remember, a middleware is called before we get to the route handler. Okay, so let's give it a shot. First thing, let's go back. And let's say I try and click on edit. I'm not logged in. It should redirect me back to where I was.